doing, CMJ? Thanks for coming out. Welcome to American Hardcore and the Rise of Modern Rock. It's a panel discussion on the early 80s American hardcore scene's impact on modern rock, particularly today's indie label and touring networks. We look at the challenges and rewards of DIY music and how long-departed bands like Black Flag and Minor Threat continue to shape our musical landscape. Hardcore was a subsect of punk, originally called hardcore punk. It was a reaffirmation of punk energy and a reaction of what it turned into, called new wave. To understand punk does not mean to understand hardcore. They are not one and the same. Hardcore literally changed the face of rock music and youth culture. If you look at a band that was big 30 years ago, it was slick corporate rock of Journey and Styx. And now you look at the bands of today, as the DIY bands of today, and it's literally day and night. Today's prototypical rock band looks less like megastars of yore like Robert Plant and David Lee Roth, and more like the gnarly hardcore kids like Harley Flanagan and Henry Rollins. Shaved heads, tattoos, modern primitivism, vegan, straight edge, mosh pits, playing dissonant tones based on speed, lack of guitar solos, and often into skateboarding. There'd be no indie, alt, emo, screamo, grunge, thrash, grindcore, death metal, stoner metal, etc., were it not for a bunch of ragtag DIY hardcore bands like Black Flag, Minutemen, and Minor Threat touring the heartland. They and their gnarly fans literally created the look and feel of modern rock. Today's icons like Nirvana, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Beastie Boys, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Sonic Youth, Metallica, Foo Fighters, on, all claim a hardcore lineage. Skate punks, riot girls, computer hackers, UFC fighters, and even WWE wrestlers all espouse the subversion of hardcore. Hardcore was the confluence of so many things, and that's what made it all so exciting at the time. It was so much more than just another rock scene. It was a world unto itself. Low-tech independent hardcore labels started by misfit teens like 30 years ago, like Black Flag's SST Records and Minor Threat's Discord Records, Bad Religion's Epitaph label, the Necros and Meatmen's Touch and Go label. That redefined music making. No longer do young bands sit around and wait for a major label to sign them. They do it themselves. Whether you realize it or not, the influence of hardcore is everywhere. The scene preached making your own opportunities and thinking outside of the box. That's what bands of all genres today too, they employ that hardcore punk DIY mentality still. The original hardcore scene was a lost subculture. There was little documentation or recognition of hardcore in the mainstream press. There was no Rolling Stone articles, no spin features, and if there was anything, it came off as derisive and misinformed. And the musical experts certainly didn't consider it real music. So in my work, kind of similar to archaeology, I had to sort all these rare artifacts into a historical narrative. Now flash forward a decade through the book and my American Hardcore documentary film with Paul Rackman, as well as the information and networking of the internet, I've both learned a lot more, and I've even reached a few new conclusions over all that time. So, in other words, while I'm correct in saying that this original movement is correct in its 1980 to 1986 arc, that conclusion does ignore a larger picture of decades of fans and believers. It's kind of like writing a book about Christianity and saying it ended with the death of Christ, right? So, a number of recent interviews, reviews of my new American Hardcore second edition. I don't have one here, but
I'll hold it.
okay. There you go. That's a good endorsement right there. And you know, it's flattering that some things have kind of used words like punk Bible to describe it, but I think really what it was, in retrospect maybe, was this Old Testament of hardcore punk and its story exclusively of the original scene and the original pioneers. The beatniks, the hippies, the punks, rappers, they were all parts of subcultures credited with changing the world. And 30 years later, I think we now can add hardcore to that continuum of youth rebellion. The immediacy of the information age has kind of destroyed a lot of most notions of subculture. So there probably can never be another scene like what took place in the hardcore days. I don't know if that's good or it's bad, but it's different. So I'm not sure where the DIY spirit lives on. And that's kind of a lot of what this panel's about. I'd prefer to say that DIY is a great ethos to live by. Don't depend on others, and you won't be disappointed. Do what you love, and do it yourself. So, I want to give big thanks to CMJ for having me here, especially Jimmy and Reverend Moose for making this happen. Big ups to my publicist, Steve Karras, and to my wife, Alyssa Fisher, for putting up with all this stuff. Most importantly, I want to thank and introduce my panelists. Michelle Rakshys, senior member of the Syndicate management firm. She booked hardcore shows in Wilkes-Barre and in New York, made that whole transition. North Six, CBGB's, Knitting Factory, the Delancey. She's toured with bands like Police and Thieves from DC. She also used to run the GetFresh.com, which lists all the hardcore shows in New York. And most interestingly, Michelle wrote her master's thesis on what major labels can learn from independent hardcore labels. I did have a different order here. Vic Bondi, frontman of the great Chicago hardcore band Articles of Faith. Later had bands Alloy and Jones Very and Report Suspicious Activities most recently. True academician, you know, known for his work with Microsoft's Encarta Educational Division. It was not easy for him to make it today. He has to leave early, but I really appreciate Vic making it out, because it was very difficult for him to, and I think he came out for you guys, really. So let's thank him for that. My far right is Jack Rabid. For over 30 years has published the legendary underground music magazine, The Big Takeover, which he started originally to document the New York hardcore scene. There's some original, that's the original ones right there.
Here's a 30th anniversary issue.
That's right. And you started it,
I'll have somebody else.
you ran it for at least 25 years out of your rundown apartment on Eldridge Street. You know, so this really goes back in the day. Jack drummed for seminal bands like Even Worse and Springhouse and Last Burning Embers. And he's a literal encyclopedia of knowledge of DIY music, and it's an honor to have him here. And last but not least, Matt Sweeney. His high school band Skunk recorded for Twin Tone Records. His next group, Chavez, might be the only alt-rock band that I like. He played in the band Zwan with rock star Billy Corrigan of Smashing Pumpkins, and he's gone on to play on albums by Johnny Cash and Neil Diamond and Dixie Chicks and Cat Power and Andrew WK and rapper LP. I invited Matt because he's been around the business for a long time. He worked for many years as a rock publicist, and he assembled Dave Grohl's hipster metal project Probot. So I want to thank everyone for being here. The format will be 1 hour roundtable discussion followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, which I strongly encourage your participation. I'll start with some pre-selected questions, and then we'll that we are selected for each panelist, and then we'll move to kind of a more open-ended topic of discussion. Jack, I want to start with you. When did you first see the genesis of this new form of punk, and exactly what was it that you saw happening that really excited you?
I was just telling Matt here that when I was going to the punk rock gigs in 77, 78, and 79, a lot of the bands were in their mid to late 20s and, you know, just playing around CBGBs in Max's Kansas City. And there weren't a lot of punk rock scenes at that time. There was like Toronto and San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, Boston, New York, you know, I mean, in North America, Vancouver. It was really a small handful of cities. And when the Bad Brains came out from Washington, D.C. the first time, we were just stunned that there was even any punk rockers in Washington, D.C. Like, didn't think it was possible. And that same year I met, I think, Henry Rollins and Ian MacKaye at a Sham 69 show. So I discovered there were actually, you know, punk rockers other than the Bad Brains. And I started hearing these records coming out of Los Angeles. I've been following all the stuff coming out of there, like the Weirdos and the Skulls and the Germs and the Controllers and all these great bands from there. But there was this new thing sort of coming up, 79 and 80, around Black Flag and TSOL and the Circle Jerks, and out of San Francisco, the Dead Kennedys and Flipper. And, you know, there was like kind of a younger and less of a rock and roll scene kind of thing happening, and the bands were playing kind of faster and louder and more obnoxious even than the original punk bands. It was kind of like a second wave of punk rock, and it was really pretty exciting, I thought. It was, to me, initially just a sub-branch of punk rock, which could have been anything from like the Screamers and Suicide, who didn't even have a guitar player or a bass player, or it could be the Cramps or Susie and the Banshees. It was a very open-ended thing, but this new wave of punk rock, what became hardcore, was much more of a faster, louder kind of subset all of its own, and I'm not surprised it became its own entity. It was pretty exciting, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, all of us were so motivated by this thing. Vic, as a major force in helping this scene grow, especially in the Midwest, what was the appeal of hardcore, and what was the original promise of hardcore? Like, what brought you to action? Because this was not just another rock band. This was much deeper.
We had punk in Chicago too, and a lot of it was borrowed, right? And I borrowed my version of hardcore from the DC guys. My parents lived in DC, and so I saw all the great DC bands in DC back in the day when I'd visit my parents, and then I went back to Chicago in '81, and I was playing with a band then. It wasn't Articles of Faith. We turned into Articles of Faith, and I said, let's play fast, let's play hard. I mean, it was that simple. It was the formula. It was fast, hard. We just wanted to do something more intense than anyone had ever done, and just play really intense music. So that was our goal, and it didn't have a lot of calculation and forethought to it. It was just, you know, how much can you push yourself in front of it? And the problem with it was also pretty alienating. You know, I mean, maybe we were doing it just to piss my parents off, or it was music designed to piss people off. That's for sure. One thing about hardcore is it even separated the new punks from the old punks. There was so much noise involved with the convention of the musical style itself that you either bought into the unlistenable noise or you didn't. If you bought in, you were part of that thing. If you didn't, you were out. So it was very binary, and it was an astonishing thing to be part of. When we drew those lines like that in Chicago, you know, all the alcoholic clubs, all the adult clubs were mobbed up, and you had a hard time getting into that scene anyway, and those club owners hated your music and they hated you, and so it by necessity turned us to doing our own shows. So in the case of our shows in Chicago, we borrowed $500 from a beer truck driver who was a friend of ours, and that was the startup money to do just a whole raft of live shows that we put on ourselves at this place called the Central American Social Club up on Broadway in Chicago. And I don't know, No Trend played there. So many bands came through, MDC, Minor Threat, Big Boys. It eventually supplanted the clubs as the place to play, and it was just a room. There was no stage. You stood on the floor. We rented some lights and speakers, and you played right there with the crowd. It wasn't, again, because this music was about, you were either part of that scene or you weren't. the band and the audience were one and the same. I mean, if you've seen pictures of Articles of Faith, it's hard to tell who the band members are because half of the crowd is on top of us and we're in the middle of them, and I would jump into the crowd and sing, and there was no separation there. And those shows were a complete, absolute blast. They were so much fun. And it was, I don't know, maybe ultimately unsustainable. It was very hard to do those shows. We had no alcohol. We put those shows on. We'd clean up the place afterwards. The place was run by Guatemalan immigrants, and they didn't know who we were. We just paid them money. It was great. Great fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what we were dealing with here, because again, the clubs and the industry itself didn't take it seriously. I mean, I was considered a manager of a band, which was kind of a joke because, I didn't really have any industry sway, So I mean, that was about as corporate as like the scene could possibly get. Matt, you grew up on the periphery of all this intense hardcore action. You were obviously inspired by it, and I just kind of want to ask you, how did it all influence your musical path? I mean, you'd obviously be a very different person had you not been turned on to all of this.
Yeah, it was the same thing in New Jersey where I grew up. I think it was like 84 or 85. I went to see bands at the Union Rec Center, which is in Union, New Jersey. And again, it was a rec center thing. And I guess, and it was hardcore. I remember getting turned on to hardcore because a friend said, I like anything so long as it's fast. It's got to be really fast, like you go. So I'd see the bands like Bodies in Panic and Bedlam and things like that, which was like a Jersey DIY scene. But interestingly, there was also like weird kind of metal bands that would play and weird bands that really didn't have like you couldn't. They didn't all sound the same. Not all the bands sound the same. There's like a thuggish element to it, and there was a sense that you could maybe get your ass beat, but it wasn't codified yet. Like it wasn't like you didn't know what was going to happen next, which I thought was really exciting. Just even like first seeing like moshing or anything like that, I didn't know what it was. You know what I mean? And like I didn't. So I guess the idea that you could put on a show, that could be local, that didn't have anything to do with rock clubs, that could be your friends. I didn't know that was possible. And I guess just sort of a sense that you could keep on, I don't know, I guess that you could do what you want outside of music-based stuff and outside of your parents' influence and stuff. I guess had a really, really big impact on me, if that makes sense. And again, I think that this stuff keeps on going. There's definitely a wave of like house party bands in the early 90s. I wasn't following it, but just stuff like Born Against and Man is the Bastard and all these weird other bands there's a complete parallel, so I think it goes in cycles. This is just to go back to you wondering like where it's at now, and is it possible to have a subculture and stuff like that? And I think it's still happening largely the same way, or like the Michigan noise scene and stuff like that, and bands like Wolf Eyes and all the stuff that goes on around them. So I don't know. I think it keeps on going.
Yeah, maybe this is a good question to kind of throw out to everybody. I kind of threw out this idea that because of the internet, because of the immediacy of that, you couldn't possibly have like a half dozen years of an underground kind of nurture itself, or 10, however you chronicleize the years. But does anybody on the panel have anything to say about it?
Well, yeah, being, coming up within like the internet age of the hardcore scene, when I started booking shows that didn't exist, people were using calling cards to call bands to get them to town, but now it is a lot easier. It is a lot easier having the internet there to not only book the bands and to find out about the new music, but just for word to get passed around, so it's a little more open, and it is a little more watered down now than I think it was before the whole internet age, when you had to pass things around through zines or through bands coming through town. But at the same time, it is its own collective scene, just because I think the people within it try to keep it out of mainstream media and try to keep it away from commercial radio stations, away from the MTV generation, and try to keep it in-house and underground. And I think it also weeds itself out, because the crazier the people within the scene get, and the crazier the bands get, and the crazier the ideas are, the more people turn away from it and are like, well, fine, I'll go listen to Kesha then. And, you know, we don't need them anyway, so it's fine.
You can't get Jack's magazine online, for example.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's still
Right.
Yeah, the idea that you can't get the big takeover, you know, like you can't just get a review and say, hey, Jack, will you post my review, right? We were talking about that before.
We do have content on our site, but it's not the same content as in the print magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's completely deliberate and stubborn on my part.
It's a lot easier to make music now than it is. I mean, 100 times easier, right? I can do demos in my basement that sound better than the records that I did in 1981, right? And it's faster, and you can make really crappy bands sound great with Pro Tools. And it's just, the ease of that is amazing. And I'm sure there's a more healthy musical scene going on because of computers than there were back in the day. We had frickin' Xerox machines, you know?
Yeah.
That was the height of technology for us, right? You know? And that was expensive too.
And Staples.
And Staples, right?
Everybody see that?
The ability to create an
3 on
idea
every page.
and publicize it and generate energy and momentum around it is much higher today than it ever was. I mean, if anything was ever revolutionary, it was computers. God, I mean, I think that was the revolution I was looking for in hardcore, frankly.
Yeah, I was going to ask this question later, but maybe it's a good time to pose it to you now, Vic. Is that, you know, with the Articles of Faith reunion that we've now been seeing, how do you see the musical terrain today as different from 25 years ago, or whatever we're speaking about here?
Well,
I mean, it's different than like when you were on the Charred Remains compilation, or you know.
Yeah. Well, that was the other thing, right? Back in the day, if you were really lucky, aficionados of the music, they would make these. They were like mixtapes, except they were mixtapes that bands who'd never been heard. So they'd go and then they'd burn 1,000 tapes, and the Charred Remains tape. That first Bad Brains record came out on that ROIR tape. Man, every band had that tape. That was like the greatest thing we'd ever heard, right?
They were staying at my house when they made that record.
Oh my God, that was
Is that right?
an
Yeah.
absolute monster. But it was a tape. It was really handed from person to person. There was no virtuality to it at all.
That's actually a very good example of what Steve was asking about, because, you know, I mentioned a band like the Weirdos or the Avengers. The Bad Brains are another example of this. Well, these are bands that played around 100, 150 gigs over 3 years' time and released one 7-inch single. There was no independent record business at that time to speak of. Very few labels, and what few labels there were very, very limited in what they wanted to do. There was, you know, Warner Brothers, and there was Columbia, and there was RCA, and all those labels, and none of them were interested in punk rock after the Dead Boys didn't sell any records in 1977 by their standards, and the Ramones didn't crack the top 40. So punk rock was considered over, and underground music in general was considered of no commercial use to them, and there were no indie labels, so these bands had nowhere to turn. And as he was saying, now if you want to make a record, you know, you don't have to worry about somebody actually coming up with $10,000 to put you in an expensive studio and then, you know, market your records and distribute them, because there's this entire subculture that exists now to help your band along. The Bad Brains tape that you were speaking of only came out as a cassette. There was not even any vinyl companies interested in that band, and they were selling 700 or 800 tickets a night when they played in New York. The Weirdos would sell out 3 nights at the Whiskey A Go-Go, you know, doing 1,500 tickets, and no one would put out their record. And now we have bands that have 8 albums and they haven't played a gig yet.
Well, I think that's the thing about the technology is that it makes it easy to appropriate any subculture as it's born anyway, unless the adherents of the subculture are very intense about what the rules are, which probably would kill the subculture anyway, right? They're going to get appropriated very quickly if they begin to grab any cultural currency whatsoever, right? Because that infrastructure exists now, and people will dial in, and they've got guys uptown who spend nothing. They do nothing all day. They work for Mindshare or for Digitas, and they spend all day looking for trends, right? And as soon as they find one they can appropriate, they're going to appropriate it.
So what does that mean for underground music?
Well, it has to go really, really underground. And I don't know if you want to dig a hole that deep, right? That you might lose some of your humanity in the process. I mean, we did with hardcore, certainly. There was a piece of it, there was a piece of it that got very inhuman after a while. It got very rules-bound and very masculine and very aggressive and very stupid, right?
That was later.
It buried itself too deep. Yeah, because at the beginning, it was a very lively scene. There were all sorts of bands playing that music. And once it became rule-bound in an effort to stay underground, right, it just got bad. So,
see, but I don't know if it got rule-bound in an effort to stay underground. It almost seemed like it got rule-bound in an effort for these people to become rock stars. When I think of like the late '80s hardcore scene, like of bands that will remain nameless, so they won't beat my ass. But they, all of a sudden it was like, okay, mosh, and it's like there are all these like moves. And then I remember finding out that a lot of these like bands saying the New York hardcore scene really wanted to be like big rock stars. I remember really being shocked, and sort of having my mind blown. It's like, oh, they're flipping the underground aspect of the hardcore thing. These guys are really see that there is some sort of jock potential for this thing. And like everybody's a jock. Everybody likes to beat the shit out of each other. So like let's like bring that energy to the people. I remember vividly feeling that way in like '86. Which, according to Steven, is when hardcore died. But then that's exactly when it got huge. You know what I mean? Like weirdly.
What do you think about that, Jack?
For me, hardcore died around 1983 or 1984, but everybody has different moratoriums. I think the original hardcore scene was very revolutionary in a lot of ways, in that the people who were speaking were saying a lot. I mean, the most popular bands were actually the most intelligent, like the Dead Kennedys and Bad Brains and Black Flag and people like that. And if you just sit down with their lyrics sheet, you couldn't help but be kind of transformed in some way, whether you were 18 or 22 or 25 or 30, because they weren't just singing like "Be My Little Baby," "Be My Baby Now." They were actually like talking about social norms and how you could actually combat them if they were too limiting, or if the police were beating your head over with a billy club every night, what you should do about that, or anything of actual substance. I mean, the Bad Brains, just by existing, and I think the Bad Brains were really the stars of Steven's film. Has everybody seen Steven's film, the American Hardcore movie? Some of you have. If you do see the film, every time they show up, and here's these four black guys in punk rock outfits coming from like the worst area of D.C. on the other side of the Anacostia River. You talk about people whose just very existence was, resistance. Just by walking down the street, they inspired fear. And they all weighed about 120 pounds at the time. Just the whole idea that you could completely throw people's, norms in their face and say, "I'm not having this," was completely revolutionary. And it was in the spirit of the music, in the spirit of the attack of the guitars and the drums. It was in the spirit of the lyrics. And it was actually a smart movement. I don't know if the internet is the sort of thing that can perpetuate that, or if it can swallow it whole, or do both at the same time. But when an art movement starts, or a means of speaking for like-minded people, it can be very, very powerful, whether it's coming in the internet or whether it's coming in a bunch of fanzines, and whether it's just people, spreading the news from one town to another by going on tour. But it was very organic, and it was very real, and it was very honest, and I think that's why people still are very fascinated by it now.
Yeah, that was a question I want to get to, is when we were kids, if you were listening to music, there's no way kids were listening to music from 30 years ago. That was like Elvis or something for me. It was like, you're right. So why do you think this is? I believe it's because the hardcore bands are like the only ones that never sold out, and people recognize that. I don't know if I'm correct in that, but there's a reason that people today talk about hardcore like it was yesterday, and they weren't there, and it's an interesting phenomenon, and rock is always like this moving and changing thing, but somehow it's not when it comes to hardcore. It's like people look back on their fathers and might be even grandfathers' music now, So I just wanted to throw that out if anybody could has an idea on that. Like why is it that we're all here talking about a music from 30 years ago that sold 2,000-3,000 copies of
They
these
would
records?
have a better answer than me.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll have to get to that.
I can tell you a story. So this was 1992, maybe. And Fugazi played at the Roseland Ballroom uptown with Jawbox. And it was just after Helmet signed their $1 million contract, right? And so there was this, all of a sudden there's this feeding frenzy on alternative bands, and everybody's going to sign up these alternative bands, and these bands are going to make fortunes, and it's right before Nirvana broke and Soundgarden broke, and so the labels finally get it. They get really aggressive, loud guitar music is back. That's the thing we're going to go after, and we're going to put a lot of money in it. And so Fugazi sells out 2 or 3 nights here in New York with Jawbox, and Fugazi was awesome, and Jawbox was awesome. But so Ian asked me if I wanted to come to the show. I'm not sure. So we were hanging out downstairs at the Roseland, down in the dressing room, and just chatting with Ian and Jay, and all of a sudden these big guys come in the room, and they're like bodyguard guys, and Ian's like, sorry Vic, you gotta go. You and Jay, you gotta get out of the room. And because Ahmet Aragon from Atlantic Records was coming down. And so the doors open and this wizened old man walks down on this cane, and he's got his bodyguards, and we all leave the room so that he, who's, I think Helmet had just signed to Atlantic for the $1 million, he could pitch Fugazi, right? Personally and directly. I want you on my label, and Ian told me about this later, but I want you on my label, And Ian never told me how much they offered them. But I guarantee you it was north of $1 million to sign with Atlantic. And Ian turned them down. He wasn't going to hear of it. He even said so before he walked in the room. He was like, oh yeah, he's going to want to sign it. There's no way that's going to happen. Right? There was the integrity, that kind of, I can't say to you that I would have done that. Right? The integrity that he had, the focus that he had on, we're not going to play that game. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it this way. We're going to do it our way, right? Which was a lot of what hardcore was about. We are going to do this our way. We don't give a damn whether you like it or not. This is the way we're going to do it. That kind of integrity, that may be part of the appeal of what it is 30 years later.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that. It was so intense. I mean, it's like, I don't think we took it as anything different at the time, but in retrospect, it wasn't just like, going to a dance and listening to a band. It was like so much, it was like so hands-on. The idea of when I was 19 years old, I'm going to George Washington University, and I go to a TSOL show in Clifton, New Jersey, and I run into Mike Brainey, the manager of the Dead Kennedys, and he's like, we can't get a show in DC, can you hook it up through your radio station? And I'm like, sure. And next thing, I'm booking the Dead Kennedys in the school cafeteria 3 blocks from the White House, and almost getting thrown out of school. And I went on this path for about 3-4 more years, booking all these bands. It's like, that was insane, but I had no other choice. It was just like, this was what this music inspired you to do. I mean, Articles of Faith was so much more than just, play the chords and play a show. It was, it was a full lifestyle. It was like, it was associated with such a bigger thing, and big
dirty lyrics.
Yeah.
Polluted damn van.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, that getting the van thing that Henry Rollins talks about, people goof on Henry Rollins a lot, but that guy went through a lot. He went through a lot, and I don't begrudge him anything, and all these guys did. All these guys in these bands are really like the pioneers that we talk about. We talk about cultural pioneers, and we talk about people who built America. This is kind of part of that. Matt, I wanted to ask you, as someone who's an active musician, we're speaking about how all this DIY, hardcore inspired modern music. What do you think bands today take from hardcore, and what do they do differently or even react against?
I don't know. Again, it seems like and this is no judgment or anything like that, but it seems like hardcore is a legitimate, it's seen, I would imagine, by younger people as a style of music, and it has something to do with playing fast and looking a certain way. And again, I mean, I would imagine that their definition of what hardcore is probably different than, and obviously all of us have slightly different definitions of it anyway, but probably a lot different, you know what I mean? So it would have to do with, I don't know what, blast beats and kind of guitar sound, and so I mean, and obviously it's hugely influential. I mean, like giant commercial bands. I mean, like really, what's that amazing band with the kids? It's really funny, and they're like we're in the club, but then there's a kid going ah. Have you seen that thing? It's so amazing. But I mean, it's like it's just big. It's big. I don't, hardcore is like big, whatever, the mall shop, whatever that mall shop is.
Hot
Topic. That's what hardcore is, and like, I mean, even the term hardcore, I remember I'd never heard the term hardcore just used in any way, and I first heard about it and talking about this punk style or whatever. And now hardcore is just like, it's like the chick from Jersey Shore, like I'm hardcore like that, and like, and everything, like so. And honestly, I really had never heard hardcore used outside of this subgenre that I happen to know about because I lived close to New York City or whatever, So.
You had something you wanted to share from the magazine?
Oh, well, this is funny. You were just talking about that. This guy, Sam McPheeters, who sang in that band Born Against, is a really interesting and funny writer, and he just wrote this article in Vice magazine, which was sent to me, and he's talking about, you were talking about pioneers, and I'm trying to find it's just, he's talking about Western expansion. It says, it's odd to think of the Wild West as something that could be closed, like a cardboard box or a failed department store. And yet in 1890, U.S. Census did precisely this, with the audacious announcement that the government would no longer tabulate Western migration as the frontier region has ceased to exist. With one stroke of a pen, the entire Wild West, all of its buttes and prairies and outlaw towns and poorly lit whorehouses, became simply the West, just one more region of the United States. And so he kind of goes on to liken that to rock and roll, and and he kind of uses hardcore since he comes from that background as an example. But it's a pretty hilarious article of, about how once something gets a name and is declared to be this thing, it's no longer valid. And there's just lots of really funny points about likening. It says vaudeville in particular has some eerie parallels with the current small indie touring band circuit. A huge national network of nightclubs, halls, and theaters existed a century ago, fueled by audiences hungry for entertainment and open to new ideas. Vaudevillians networked, hustled, and endured long stretches of downtime, just like traveling musicians today. Overall, the internal combustion engine and the two eras of touring look awfully similar, but there's one big difference. Vaudevillians were acutely aware of their own market. If your act bombed, you retooled it. As blackface became less and less politically palatable, blackface grew scarce, etc. And now the current world of band is a freakish anomaly because they feel, he just goes on to say, they feel like they should just be allowed to express themselves as opposed to adhere to rules. Anyway, well, this is an interesting article.
This article that he brings up, though, raises an interesting point, though, is about, he's kind of saying that rock is dead. And I think if you look at art movements, there's always like the movement and then there's the post-movement. And, rock is something that happened for 50 years, somewhere at the end of the 20th century. And there's bands today who call themselves post-rock. And I think that's genius because that's really what it is. It's post-rock. Has nothing to do with Elvis or Guns N' Roses or punk rock or anything. It's post-rock. It's like, it's using the framework of rock, but it's not rock. So it's like the band. It's like those guys at the end of World War II. They find these Japanese soldiers stranded on islands. Like 5 years later, they didn't know the war was over. There's still people playing rock. Like no one's tapped them on the shoulder and kind of said, let's move on, guys. Michelle, you grew up with all this, hardcore DIY ethic around you, and I just kind of wanted to ask you, like, do you see the ethic at all in the bands you work with, or maybe in other bands? And also, you kind of are in this kind of quasi-corporate world at the Syndicate, and I kind of wanted to know where you see that some of this stuff is applied, where are the similarities and where are the differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially just since the whole internet revolution coming through and people buying less records and, are they going to buy online? Do they just share it online? And that bringing down record sales, a lot of the smaller indie labels have taken on the DIY ethics and less of, well, we want to be bought by a major label. We want to be distributed by a major label, and have completely just gone back and said, well, how have these other record labels succeeded? Because if you look at a lot of the smaller, like hardcore record labels, they're doing fine. Like they're still selling records, but it's because they keep in touch with their fan base. And if the fans don't want CDs and they want vinyl, well, they'll sell them vinyl. If they want to buy T-shirts instead, well, fine, we'll sell them T-shirts. We'll sell them whatever they want to buy. If it keeps the band on the road and it keeps the family together. So I think a lot of the indie rock labels have also started looking at that, and not so much we are preaching down to our followers, but more so this is a back and forth conversation, you as the fans and us as the people giving you the music. And if this is what you want, then we're going to do it that way. But also from the marketing side, which is more so what I deal with, we have a nationwide street team, and that definitely goes back to the hardcore scene, passing out flyers to people who are interested. It's just that now we're doing that for corporations because they realize what's going to get more attention, putting a flyer in the hand of somebody who's really interested in having a conversation with them, or putting a commercial on TV. And of course, having a conversation always beats it, and that's what hardcore kids have been doing since the 80s. You put a flyer in their hand, you say, yo, you should go to this. They don't know what it is. You tell them why they should go to it, and then they go. And that's definitely why major labels come to us all the time and say, well, yeah, I had this new baby band coming up. We need people at their shows. How are you going to fix this? It's like, all right, well, let's print up some flyers. We'll tell them why they should be at the show, send out people in that city to hand out flyers and tell people to go to that show for that reason. So I think that, it's 100% taking it back to that. But also just like you were talking about with, that's like the version of the CD sampler, with Bad Brains, and that's what bands used to pass around, and record labels still put those things together. I must have picked up 3 of them just like conventions that are now. They're bands I'd never heard of, and that's still, if they're being shipped over from Sweden and Australia, that's, it's just that the touring network isn't, oh, what's going on the East Coast? Now it's, it's worldwide, and we still want samplers. We still need to find out about these bands, because we're not checking out MySpace pages of bands from Australia.
Sure. To all of you, I kind of want to throw out, a major premise of the old days of the hardcore and DIY was to minimize the major labels or even to destroy the record business. And now that that's actually happened, is that a good thing? There's this old saying that when the gods want to punish you, they answer your prayers.
I think it's great. I think it's great. I hated the record industry when I was in it. I couldn't stand it. I wanted to destroy it. There were terrible fucking bands. They were being pushed on us every day. God, I would just, the level of frustration that I would have driving through the city listening to AM radio or FM radio blasting fucking Bad Company, just like why wouldn't you want all of that obliterated, right, at the end of the day? And it's actually hard. It is, you say hardcore band, alternative struggles. I'm sure Discord's the same. It's not the environment for music today is difficult for you to make a business of it, so maybe it's a Pyrrhic victory because it just seems like there's still a lot of bad music. If the idea of destroying the record industry was to get rid of all the bad music and replace it with the good music, we have not succeeded.
Anybody else on that? Because I think that's an interesting point too, because it's like it was so hands-on, like we hate the record companies and we're going to do it ourselves, and well, now you have to do it yourself. And I just, what I think is, as much as I hated as a journalist and a publisher and dealing with all these labels and all their bullshit, on the other hand, they were a good filter. There was like certain, I'm not saying their music was good, but like you know, there's too much music now. You know, it's like you can't. There's no filter. You know, so it's like at least there was. I mean, maybe those geniuses weren't right, but they were. I don't know. Do any of you have any input on this?
I did a little statistical count last year and realized that in the early 80s, the big Takeover used to receive, on the average, about 8 or 9 pieces of vinyl a week in those pre-CD days. It was the only format at the time. And last year, we averaged about 27 submissions a day, not including the digital submissions, which averaged another 14 to 15 a day. And when you total that up, that's about 42 to 43 albums being submitted every day to our offices, including the weekends. And there isn't, as Vic said, any higher number of great bands today than there were then. There is just an explosion of product, both available commercially and quasi-demos. I mean, what exactly is a digital release? I don't know. Hasn't been pressed on anything. Is it an actual album? Well, it is, in the sense that I can download it and listen to it if I wanted. But
It's kind of like manual release.
and I don't know what to do with this. I can't listen. If you do the math, if I listen to all these albums, I better not sleep, I better not eat, I better not take a shower, I better listen to only like 10 minutes of each record. It's just a physical impossibility, let alone to actually try to discern which of those 43 pieces of music are actually worth my time in passing along to our readers. So we went from an era, like I said, where the Avengers went on for 3 years and released one 7-inch single and left behind some 40 to 50 unreleased songs to a point where it's really cheap to record and really cheap to distribute your music. And it has created a massive, massive glut.
But maybe also, it's interesting, maybe also the emotion is cheaper too, right? So I can, any brain fart that I have in my head, I can go downstairs and fire up the computer and track it.
Sure, yeah.
Right? But I remember that first Articles of Faith record. You know, it cost $800. That was more than all of us earned in like 3 months, right? I mean, we worked so hard to get the money up to go out to Schaumburg, Illinois, into the burbs where Cheap Trick recorded and record the 4 songs, man. I can remember mixing it on the floor, and I was dead because we had to get it. There it is.
Awesome.
$800 well spent.
Yeah.
I mean, but we worked so hard for that, and it's like you said, Jack. It was a real record. It had to be pressed, and then it went to the mastering plant. And you got back this mastered record with the paper centerpiece that just had rainbow records, and you put it on and you listened. Are there any blips, pops, cracks? We'll have to send it back, right? And then you waited for the pressing of the record to come to you. It was just, and just in those days, we had to assemble it. So, we went down to Xerox and we Xeroxed all those, the white cover is the valuable cover. All those white covers, right? And then we cut them up with scissors and we folded them by hand and we stuck every single one of those 1,000 records by hand, right? Like, the emotional delta between that experience and what I can do today is substantial.
There's a thing that touches on this in the same article. A May 2001 issue of Billboard spelled out, at the turn of the century, independent labels were responsible for 71% of all albums released. That's the turn of the century. More than 200,000 titles. Even with the smallest of pressings, 1,000 per, this meant the creation of more than 200 million new physical objects. This is 10 years ago. In just that 1 year.
And they all came to me.
And for just that one category. But only 17% of the cash from album sales actually went back to these indie labels. And the average sale for indie labels was only 635 units per title. I mean, that is kind of absolutely mind-blowing to me. In any sphere of human activity, such behavior has a name: economic bubble. So and then album sales have plummeted 60% since then. So compact discs are luxuries. Once were luxuries, now they're clutter. So again, there's a glut of jams. I mean, 200,000 titles.
Well, there is a glut, but there's also a totally different way of people getting music. You know, if I like the Articles of Faith record, I might tape it for a friend of mine, and he might take his cassette and not pay Vic Bondi his $2. Sorry, Vic.
Home taping is killing music.
Or maybe he would like it and get to know the song and then go out and buy the record. But people actually wanted the artifact back then. And if record sales are plummeting, it's partially because if I like the song, I have it on my iTunes and I share it with 10 of my friends just by sending them the file. And none of them have to buy anything and nobody wants to buy anything. So I don't know if that's really a fair assessment of what happened to the music business. A glut certainly never helps. But I'm still finding plenty of great bands, you know, not 42 a day, but there's always one or two in that submission process that has some potential. And there's always people telling me, just like 30 years ago, that this band down the street in Chicago is really great now to check them out. You know, there's still engines word of mouth of the quality rising to the top. It didn't really take a major label filter, I think, Steve.
Yeah.
They were really only interested in peddling, you know, phony baloney teen rebellion like it was still Elvis.
Right.
You know, anything with the veneer of rebellion is what they were interested. They didn't want to actually sell anything that might actually shake anything up. That would be bad for corporate profits. Or else they would have been, you know, embracing the Dead Kennedys. Of course they weren't going to embrace a band called the Dead Kennedys or Black Flag. That wasn't going to be like a thing that was going to unseat Journey. Was it? You know, they want to do that Don't Stop Believin' crap, right? And there's Dead Kennedys singing Kill the Poor. You think that's going to coexist? No, I don't think so. So there still is a substance out there. There's still some kid who's just dying to tell you something that he's desperate to tell you about. There's still somebody who sees like the artistic potential in rock or post-rock or whatever you want to call it. You know, just because you handed a guy a guitar and a bass and drums doesn't mean he has to sound like every other band that ever existed. It isn't just a lifestyle for everybody. Some people really are desperate to speak, and those are the people that I'm trying to find. And they're out there still.
I'm going to open it up to the floor in a minute for a couple questions, but I just want to kind of ask one last question to Jack. We both have kind of a similar path, you know, kind of well-educated kids from Jersey and came to New York with this kind of whole DIY.
This is the New Jersey pedal.
Exactly. No, but this is kind of like, you know, you came to like live this kind of uncompromising DIY lifestyle, and in many ways it's been incredibly rewarding, but there's a high price you pay. You have to be really strong to do this. You know, this DIY thing I'm not throwing out around lightly. This is like, you're all in. So kind of talk about the fun, you know.
Well, the emotional connection that Vic was talking about, I understand completely what he means, is that when something is easy, do we really, really, really value it? You know, do you have to live in a desert to think that a glass of water is really valuable? Probably. Otherwise, you just walk over to the tap and you stick on the tap, right? I can have it anytime I want it. You know, I was a kid who came from some suburban privilege. I'm from Summit, New Jersey, and my parents thought that punk rock was an alien invasion and that I joined the Moonies. You know, I wanted to spend all my time in the most ramshackle, broken down, poverty-stricken elements filled with crime and drugs in bankrupt New York City, you know, where no suburban kid really ought to be, but I thought it was the only place I wanted to be. And I don't say that to glorify myself, it's just that there was this really exciting thing happening, and I came from this really dull suburb. They couldn't see it that way. They still don't see it that way. My mother's still mad at me for putting the suburbs down in every book or documentary. Sorry. I have a lot of suburban readers. They're mad at me too. But, you know, going to Max's Kansas City and CBGB's wasn't like some kind of lifestyle choice for me. It was a complete subversion of every value that I'd ever been taught, and yet I thought it was actually more important. It was my high school. It was my church. It was my education as a human being to think completely differently. I had parents who taught me to think for myself, but then they didn't actually want me to do it. That's kind of a weird contradiction. And this is basically what society does. They always keep telling you, be a rebel, be an individual, buy our product. We have the answer, and it's this thing on this commercial. But no, it isn't. It's really what you personally want to do and what you want to say and what you want to think. and you don't want to be that prescribed. So like a guy like Steve, throwing himself into his, booking. I saw his band No Trend a bunch. They were completely fabulous, completely unlike anything I'd ever seen. And this is what I was looking for. It was like an art movement as well as an intellectual movement, and it was a goddamn fun time as well. Why would I want to go back to the suburbs or back to an area where people are only considering what car they ought to buy? Well, I didn't even want a car. I've never owned one. I'm 48 years old. I go everywhere else in the country, and people go like, how can you live without a car? How can you live with one? How do you get groceries? I go to the store and I bring them home. How do you get groceries? I mean, it's just like people, they don't want to actually think for themselves. They want things easy. Their idea of taking a walk on the wild side is like going down to St. Mark's Place and looking at people with funny hairdos and buying a pizza pie. There's not a lot of things we can do to change most people's not wanting to come out of their comfort level, but you can offer them an alternative if they want to come to you, with people who actually do think for themselves and do things for themselves. And whether you call it hardcore in 1981 or indie rock or do-it-yourself or anything, mostly it's just a revolt of people trying to think for themselves. It's always a healthy thing for people to do.
Awesome. So, I'm sorry. No, okay. I'm going to open this up now to the floor. I hope you take advantage of it. I know it always takes one brave soul to stand up first.
Got a lot of brave souls.
All right. Yeah, pass the microphone, sure.
It's like Donahue.
Yeah. I feel like I'm on the hardcore one with Donahue, yeah.
So, are there any, or what modern bands that came out in the last few years do you guys admire, artists do you admire, and are there any major label artists that you guys like a lot? And this is just for everyone.
Go, sure, shit. I don't know. I mean, I always kind of get tongue-tied with those kind of questions. There's a lot. I mean, I don't know. I like this band, the Arboretum. I guess they're kind of new. I guess they're indie. I don't even know. And then on a major label, I don't really care if they're on a major label or not at all. But then wait, a major label thing that I've listened to, I don't know, probably
But there's this
R. Kelly. I don't know. I think he's awesome, And I'm trying to think of some kind of underground thing that really knocked me. I don't know. I mean, that kid Cass McCombs just keeps on making amazing stuff, and seems like he's a true embodiment of thinking for yourself and having some voice that he's just going to do what he's going to do. Are you familiar with his stuff, Cass?
A little bit, yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
No, we reviewed it.
Yeah, so I mean, I still check out new stuff all the time. There's tons and tons and tons. And again, and just in my case, the older I get, there's only so much pleasure. There's only so many amazing shows that you can see before they start to remind you of other amazing shows that you've seen. You know what I mean? And it's I'm old, so it's I don't expect to have my mind blown. And even if it does get blown, it's because it's still. It's yeah, it was when I saw that other thing back when I was a kid or whatever. So I mean, I hope that helps.
Well, I mean, for newer stuff that I've been listening to, Foundation is one of my favorite current hardcore bands that's out there. They definitely keep the 90s hardcore message moving forward, which I really appreciate. Most of the stuff that's on the React Records roster, bands like Mindset, I think, are amazing. They're from Baltimore. Praise, Sacred Love, Get the Most, Go It Alone. A lot of that kind of stuff is more so what I listen to when it comes to the hardcore genre. And then, I hate to just listen to that stuff. I definitely listen to a lot of indie rock, a lot of dance stuff, but typically what I tell my friends is I kind of treat it like candy. You can't subsist on it. You can't base your diet on candy. So if I feel like listening to, Jay Sean on the radio, that's great and all, but that's not the substance that you need. And my substance comes from React Records and some of the stuff that gets put out on Death Wish Records, and Bridge 9 does some good stuff occasionally. So
Oh yeah, Cerebral Ballsy, that was a good hardcore band that I saw recently. They're really good. Cerebral Ballsy, they're like 19 and they sound like some band from the early 80s. And they're really, really good.
And I think Incendiary is another band who's either playing tonight or tomorrow. Yeah, and they're that should be a great show. And Iron Age is playing at Mercury Lounge tomorrow, and they're a great band on TP. So
That's great. We have another question?
So we discussed how hardcore is a very broad genre. So I guess the bands like Agnostic Front and the bands like Ramallah, and they go have a show, and then you see someone get beat and killed afterwards. It happened with Ramallah and Agnostic Front last week.
What? At the Agnostic Front shows?
Yeah,
At
some guy
DC9
in
Washington.
Fuck. So how do you respond to that? That's what people think of hardcore.
Yeah.
That comes to mind, etc. What's your response to that?
I think that was something everybody was eventually worried about happening. I think that was, it wasn't, let's be clear about what happened with that Agnostic Front thing was that they were not part of it. It took place outside and had something to do with the bouncers and somebody on the street in
As it
DC.
generally does.
Yeah, and I lived in DC and I could vouch for who knows what they were dealing with. This guy broke a window and threatened a few people, and it was if you don't know, the kind of bouncers went vigilante, actually killed this guy. And that was the end of the DC9 club in Washington, D.C.
But that's just like Altamont in the 60s at the Rolling Stones concert where the Hells Angels, who were the security, killed a guy. So it's that stuff happens and it's really disturbing and, but I don't know, there's not much, there's not a lot of control that you can have,
yeah, didn't somebody get killed at the 50 Cent movie
Probably.
premiere when that came
Yeah.
out? So, yeah, you can't. 50 Cent's been shot, but he didn't provoke that shooting at his movie theater.
Right. We're not going to kid that we're not playing with fire here. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not going to sit here and a lot of my hardcore friends are these thugs who give this kind of well, who knows what's going to happen. You do know what's going to happen.
Right,
I think we're all kind of excited by that, but I think a lot of us bailed on it too when it got that scary. I think that's what we're all talking about is why we all kind of at a certain point, close the book and move on. I think I moved on from this stuff 25 years ago, but I found the pull, and I found that hardcore had such a profound influence on my life, no matter how far I had gone away from it, which led to me doing the book and the film and all that kind of stuff. But it was my ethics. In other words, I had my ethics I had learned from my family, and I had the ethical code I had learned from the hardcore scene. And that's a very intense thing. So, but yeah, I'm very troubled about what you brought up. I think we have time for one more question.
I come from a background very similar to yours, Jack. I'm from Union County, New Jersey. I live in Boston now, though, where I always hear people who are older than I say, hardcore is dead. But not to say that it's very much alive, but I go to shows every weekend all the time. And I see the scene facing problems that, seem to be limitations that people faced in the past, how do you deal with keeping a DIY venue that is someone's basement from getting shut down, and how do you get people to respect your space and stuff like that. And I wanted to know what your guys' advice is, because I think that there's a lot of potential and that cool things happen, but then there's the whole legal issue and the whole destruction aspect that gets in the way.
That would be a great panel. It's just that.
Yeah.
It's true. The idea of putting on your own shows and the attendant problems that happen, and that's again, this has been going on since people have been gathering to make music that was outside of the mainstream. So you probably know better than me. But
Yeah, the one thing that I talk about is I'm not
cool.
Yeah, my thing is I'm not trying to raid on everybody's parade and go oh, what you're into is lame. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm saying oh, the stuff's over. I'm just saying that there was it's kind of like saying there was blues music by the innovators like Robert Johnson with the Delta Blues, and then 50 years later there's Eric Clapton playing blues.
Or the Robert Cray Band.
Right. So it's you're not wrong if you're saying there's really no answer to this. But I would submit that hardcore today is another cool genre of music. It's where somebody could always up the ante. But I think what I'm looking for is the social and political force. I'm looking I'm looking at kids. I thought, it's our job to change the world. It's like, that's what I thought rock portended. I thought that's what we're supposed to do as young, independent minds. Like the kids not hanging out at the shopping mall. We're like the ones who, had something to bring to the table, and that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm talking about that died. I'm not talking about somebody could still play the most intense, blast beat or, mosh beat. That's cool. I like a lot of bands. I like records every few years, still blow me away. But what I'm talking about is, like, are you putting this on the line? Are you ready to change the world with music? I mean, that, to me, is the legacy of hardcore. I'm getting that signal. So, thank you so much all for coming.
Thanks a lot. Thank you to CMJ.